The chandelier lights of the Regal Crown Hotel glittered like frozen stars, casting their brilliance across the marbled lobby, where power itself seemed to walk on polished floors. For 30 years, Jonathan Hale had lived for this world of opulence and order. He was not just the owner of the Regal Crown, he was its heart. Every stone, every velvet curtain, every polished glass pane bore his mark of control. He had seen dignitaries laugh over champagne in his ballroom, presidents nod in quiet approval, and international celebrities whisper secrets behind velvet ropes. The Regal Crown was his fortress, his monument to a lifetime of ambition. But in one instant, his fortress began to tremble. The world's eyes were upon him as the hotel prepared to host the most important deal of his life, a global summit that promised to open a door Jonathan had chased for decades. At stake was not only $50 million in contracts, but the gateway to Asia's vast markets. This deal would define the Regal Crown's legacy long after Jonathan was gone. Yet fate has a way of testing even the most powerful. Standing in the center of the lobby was Mr. Liang Chen, a man whose name carried weight heavier than steel across the business world. Known for transforming industries overnight, he was feared and admired in equal measure. Nations bent their ears when he spoke. Entire economies shifted with his decisions. Dressed in a suit cut so sharply it could have drawn blood, Liang Chen stood tall, his face calm. But his silence screamed like thunder. His entourage surrounded him like shadows, men and women who carried themselves with the assurance of those who followed greatness. Jonathan's throat tightened. His translator, the only one capable of navigating the delicate nuances of Mandarin, had canceled last minute due to a family crisis. Hours of preparation now crumbled into chaos. Liang Chen was asking pointed questions about the hotel's security systems, its digital infrastructure, its capacity to handle an event of this scale. Jonathan heard the Mandarin words fly like arrows, each one landing with precision, but none finding a shield. His staff stood frozen, eyes wide with panic, their polished uniforms doing little to hide their helplessness. "Does anyone here speak Mandarin?" Jonathan's voice cracked, breaking through the air like glass shattering. Silence answered him. Waiters stiffened, receptionists glanced at one another, bellboys shifted uncomfortably. But no one moved. His empire of perfection, built on control, had failed him at the very moment it mattered most. A bead of sweat slid down Jonathan's temple. He adjusted his cufflinks with trembling hands, trying to mask the storm that raged inside. The conference contract, the dream of decades, was slipping through his fingers like sand. He looked at Liang Chen, whose eyes now sharpened, cool and unflinching. This was a man who did not tolerate incompetence. A man who had ended partnerships with empires far greater than Jonathan's for far less. The weight in the lobby grew unbearable. The silence was suffocating, as though the marble walls themselves leaned in to witness his humiliation. And then, just as Jonathan felt the ground beneath him collapse, a voice rose soft, uncertain at first, yet clear. "I can," the voice said in perfect Mandarin. The lobby turned. A collective breath caught in the throats of everyone present. From the shadows near the corner, where cleaning carts stood quietly lined, a figure stepped forward. It was a cleaner and older man whose gray uniform bore the marks of long days and thankless tasks. His shoes were worn, his hands calloused, his back bent slightly from years of labor. For years he had moved invisibly through the gilded halls, unnoticed by the guests, unseen by the powerful, unacknowledged even by Jonathan himself. Now, in the silence of that moment, he stood revealed. His words had flowed with a fluency that struck the room like lightning, his Mandarin flawless, his tone respectful yet commanding. Liang Chen's eyes shifted. For the first time, the billionaire's composure faltered. He studied the cleaner, with a flicker of interest, a raised brow, the kind of acknowledgement that kings reserved for worthy challengers. Jonathan's heart pounded. His mind could not grasp what had just unfolded. The man who polished marble floors and carried trash bags was now bridging the abyss that threatened to swallow his empire. It felt impossible, almost unreal, that salvation would come from the lowest rung of his staff. The cleaner bowed slightly and began answering Liang Chen's questions with precision. He explained the hotel's security systems, its networks, Its protocols details Jonathan had not realized anyone outside his management team even knew. The cleaner spoke calmly, his voice flowing like a river, each answer pulling Liang Chen back from the edge of departure. Guests who had been watching the scene whispered in astonishment. Staff stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide as though witnessing a miracle. And Jonathan, once the master of every detail, the man who believed only he could hold the regal crown together, felt something break inside him. For the first time in his long career, he was no longer the most important man in the room. The billionaire leaned forward, listening intently, and a faint smile curved across his lips. The cleaner's words were not only accurate, they carried depth, wisdom, and a quiet authority that demanded respect. When the cleaner finally paused, Liang Chen gave a small nod, his voice smooth yet firm as he replied in Mandarin. And then, astonishingly, he extended his hand. The cleaner hesitated, then shook it. The entire lobby exhaled. A storm had passed. The deal, though still fragile, was no longer lost. And standing at the center of it all was not Jonathan Hale, the polished CEO, but the man he had least expected, the man whose story was just beginning to unfold. Jonathan stared at the cleaner, his thoughts racing. Who was this man? How had he hidden such a gift in silence all these years? And why, out of everyone in the regal crown, did he step forward only now? Uncertainty and awe wrestled inside Jonathan's chest. He did not yet know it, but his world was about to change forever, not because of the billion-dollar contracts or the powerful guests in suits of silk, but because of a man who carried a mop, spoke like a scholar, and reminded everyone in that glittering lobby that greatness often wears the humblest of faces. And as the crowd murmured in wonder, Jonathan felt the unshakable truth settle into his bones. The story that had just begun would not be about wealth or power or even success. It would be about the courage of an unseen man stepping into the light, and how one voice, rising from the shadows, could alter the destiny of them all. Jonathan could not sleep that night. The hotel stood as it always did, glowing with its golden lights against the New York skyline, but to him it felt different, as though a hidden door had opened. He paced through the quiet corridors, the marble floors echoing his footsteps, his mind replaying the moment over and over. The cleaner, stepping forward, speaking fluent Mandarin with the grace of a diplomat, it had shaken him in ways he did not fully understand. For 3 decades, Jonathan had built his empire on the belief that he alone was the orchestrator of success. He believed that every triumph came from his discipline, his foresight, his uncompromising standards. Yet in a single moment, a man who spent his life unnoticed had saved everything. The irony gnawed at him. It humbled him. He found himself wanting to know more. Who was this man? Where had he come from? How could someone with such brilliance be pushing a cart of brooms and mops in the back corridors of the regal crown? The next morning, while most of the staff prepared nervously for another day of high-stakes negotiations, Jonathan quietly asked the head of housekeeping about the cleaner. The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously as though she feared she might have done something wrong. His name is Wei, she finally whispered. He's been with us for years, keeps mostly to himself, works double shifts sometimes, never complains, always early, always stays late. To be honest, sir, most of us don't know much about him. Jonathan felt a strange pull, something between curiosity and guilt. For years, this man had walked past him, invisible. For years, Jonathan's eyes had skimmed over him without a second thought, as though he were part of the furniture, a fixture in the grand halls. Yet last night, it was Wei's voice that had steadied the trembling foundations of his empire. Later that day, Jonathan saw him again. Wei was in the garden courtyard, sweeping leaves that had blown in through the iron gates. The world had just watched him stand before one of the most powerful billionaires alive, but here he was, sweeping quietly, as though nothing had changed. His posture was calm, his movements steady, almost meditative. Jonathan approached slowly, unsure of what to say. Wei, he began, his voice low. The cleaner paused, looked up, and offered a polite smile before bowing his head slightly. You saved us yesterday, Jonathan said. His words carried weight, but Wei shook his head gently. I only did what I could," he replied softly. His English was accented but clear, his tone humble. Sometimes life puts us in places we do not expect. Jonathan studied him. There was something in his eyes, calm, steady, but also carrying shadows of a past untold. That evening, when the hotel quieted again, Jonathan invited him to sit down in a private lounge. The cleaner hesitated, uncomfortable with the grandeur of the space, but Jonathan insisted. For the first time in his life, the CEO sat across from a man he once might not have noticed and asked a question that felt heavier than any business deal. "Who are you, really?" Wei hesitated. For a long time, he said nothing, his gaze drifting to the window where the city lights twinkled like distant stars. Finally, he began to speak, his voice measured, carrying the weight of memories that had been buried too long. He spoke of growing up in a small town in rural China, where opportunity was scarce but dreams were boundless. His parents had worked tirelessly, teaching him the value of humility and perseverance. From an early age, he showed a gift for language. He devoured books in Mandarin, then taught himself English, French, and later Japanese by reading borrowed dictionaries and listening to old radio recordings. Words, Wei said softly, were my way of traveling when my feet could not. Jonathan leaned forward, captivated. Wei continued. He had once been a teacher, deeply respected in his community. He taught children not only language, but also hope, the belief that, even from the poorest corners of the earth, dreams could take flight. His students adored him. Parents thanked him. For a time, his life felt rich with purpose, even if not with money. But fate, as it often does, intervened cruelly. A local company collapsed. That spread across families, and Wei found himself responsible for others' losses. To protect his students, he sold everything he owned. To help his parents, he gave up his home. Piece by piece, the life he had built unraveled, until the only path left was to leave behind everything he knew. He came to America, hoping to rebuild, to start again. Yet here, the world did not see the teacher, the scholar, the man of languages. It saw only a cleaner. He worked job after job, washing dishes, hauling boxes, scrubbing hotel floors. Every day was a test of endurance, but he never allowed bitterness to take root. Dignity, he told Jonathan, his voice steady, is not in the work we do, but in the heart we bring to it. Jonathan sat in silence, his chest heavy. He had spent his life surrounded by power and wealth, yet this man, in his gray uniform and calloused hands, radiated a strength and wisdom far beyond any boardroom he had ever entered. And then Wei said something that would haunt Jonathan for days. Greatness often hides in silence. "Mr. Hale, people look at me and see only a cleaner. But what matters is not how the world sees us, it is how we choose to serve the world, no matter where we stand." The words pierced Jonathan like an arrow. For years, he had measured worth in contracts, in figures, in prestige. Yet sitting across from this man, he realized that worth could not be calculated in ledgers. It lived in unseen sacrifices, in quiet endurance, in courage unrecognized. Outside, the night deepened, and the hotel lights glowed against the darkness. For Jonathan, something had shifted. He had begun this conversation out of curiosity, perhaps even pity, but he ended it with something unexpected, reverence. And as Wei excused himself, bowing politely before slipping back into the quiet halls of the Regal Crown, Jonathan sat alone with a truth he could no longer ignore. This man was no ordinary cleaner. He was a story waiting to be told, a hidden flame in the shadows. And Jonathan knew, with a certainty he had never felt before, that his own life would never be the same again. The next morning, the Regal Crown felt charged with something invisible. The staff moved quickly, whispering in corners, their eyes drifting often toward the quiet man in the gray uniform, who pushed his cleaning cart through the hallways as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But to them, everything had changed. The cleaner who once seemed invisible had stood before one of the most powerful men in the world, and spoken with authority that had silenced an entire lobby. They did not know how to approach him now, whether to treat him with awe or to continue pretending he was just part of the background. Jonathan noticed it too. For years, He had walked these corridors like a king, expecting perfection, demanding silence, and leaving little room for anything human beneath the polished surface. Yet he could feel the air shifting. His employees were no longer whispering about him. They were whispering about Wei. A man he had overlooked for nearly a decade now seemed to carry more respect in a single evening than Jonathan had commanded. In years, the contract with Liang Chen was still on the table. Negotiations would resume, and the stakes remained high. Jonathan knew he should be thinking about figures, presentations, and strategy, but his mind kept circling back to the cleaner. A single truth gnawed at him. Wei had saved him once, but what if Liang Chen demanded more? Could he afford to place the fate of his empire in the hands of someone he barely understood? That afternoon, as Liang Chen's entourage prepared for another round of discussions, Jonathan noticed Wei quietly polishing a glass door near the conference room. He thought about telling him to step aside, to leave things to the professionals. But then he remembered the billionaire's eyes when Wei had spoken Mandarin the way a wall of ice had melted into interest. Something about that encounter had shifted not only Jonathan, but also Liang Chen. It was clear, if Wei was not present, the deal would unravel again. So Jonathan made a choice he had never imagined making. He called Wei into the conference room. The staff looked on in disbelief as the cleaner entered the polished chamber, his uniform plain among suits and silk ties. Liang Chen raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his eyes gleaming with a faint spark of recognition. Jonathan cleared his throat, forcing authority into his voice as he explained, "This man will assist us." The meeting began, and once again, Wei's voice carried the room. He translated with precision, but more than that, he listened, truly listened in a way no professional interpreter ever had. He caught nuances, softened edges, and shifted tones so that both sides felt not only understood, but respected. The staff marveled at his ability to transform sharp questions into bridges of dialogue. Jonathan sat watching, feeling both humbled and strangely proud, as though he were witnessing a miracle that belonged to him but did not. Hours passed. When the meeting finally ended, Liang Chen surprised everyone. Instead of leaving in silence, he lingered. He turned to Wei and spoke directly to him, asking questions not about the hotel, but about life, about where he came from. The room fell silent as Wei answered humbly, choosing his words carefully, never boasting, never asking for sympathy. And then, to everyone's astonishment, Liang Chen laughed a sound no one in the room had heard before. The billionaire placed a hand on Wei's shoulder and said something in Mandarin that Jonathan could not follow. But the meaning was clear. Respect. As the entourage filed out, Jonathan caught the curious glances of his staff. They were no longer looking at him for direction, they were looking at Wei. That night, Jonathan wrestled with a feeling he could not name. It was not jealousy, though part of him ached to realize his own power had dimmed. It was something deeper. It was the recognition that greatness had been walking beside him all along. Unnoticed. Wei returned to his routine, sweeping floors, polishing mirrors, collecting trash bags. But the staff began to move differently round him. A bellboy who once ignored him now stopped to ask questions. A housekeeper quietly thanked him for helping her carry supplies. The chef, known for his arrogance, offered him tea during a break. Slowly, the invisible man began to shine, not because he demanded it, but because his humility drew people in. And yet, beneath the surface, there was something unspoken. A shadow in Wei's eyes when he thought no one was looking. He carried himself with dignity, but his silence hinted at scars no one had asked about. Jonathan found himself drawn to it, restless with curiosity. Why would a man with such brilliance choose to remain hidden? Why accept a life of mops and buckets when he clearly belonged in the highest circles of influence? The answer came unexpectedly. One evening, Jonathan followed Wei outside after his shift. He found him sitting on a bench in the courtyard, staring up at the night sky, his posture calm but heavy with thought. For a moment, Jonathan considered walking away, but then he sat down beside him. "You could be anywhere," Jonathan said quietly. "You could be teaching, leading, changing lives. Why here? Why now?" Wei's gaze did not move from the stars. His voice was low when he answered, Because sometimes the world does not ask where we belong. It only asks if we will keep going. I lost more than you can imagine, Mr. Hale, but I did not lose myself. This work, it is not who I am. It is only the path I must walk until another opens. Jonathan felt a chill. There was a story buried in those words, something painful, something that explained the shadow behind his calm eyes. But Wei said no more, and Jonathan did not press. The silence stretched between them, deep and powerful, and in that silence, Jonathan realized something he had never admitted before. For all his wealth, for all his control, he had never known true strength. Not like this man. The next morning, as negotiations resumed, Jonathan noticed something extraordinary. The staff, once timid and scattered, now carried themselves with quiet confidence. They looked at Wei, and through him, they found courage. He had become more than a cleaner, more than a translator. He had become a symbol, a reminder that dignity and greatness could rise from anywhere, even from the shadows. And as Jonathan watched Liang Chen's entourage prepare for the final round of talks, a thought gripped him like fire. Perhaps fate had not placed Wei in his hotel to save a contract. Perhaps fate had placed him there to save Jonathan himself. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the Regal Crown. As the city outside blurred beneath a gray sky, the hotel bustled with its usual rhythm, guests checking in, staff moving briskly, laughter rising from the bar, but within its golden halls, an invisible tension coiled like a string pulled too tight. The final day of negotiations with Liang Chen had arrived. Jonathan had barely slept. He stood in his office overlooking the lobby, his reflection fractured in the glass. The deal was closer than it had ever been, but his certainty had begun to falter. In the past, he relied on preparation, on details perfected to the last decimal, on his ability to bend circumstances to his will. But this time, the balance did not rest on numbers or contracts. It rested on a man who pushed a mop. Wei. The thought unsettled him, not because he doubted the man's ability. He had seen enough to know his talent was extraordinary, but because he could not understand why fate had hidden such brilliance and such humility. He had tried to uncover pieces of Wei's past, asking quiet questions among the staff, searching records, but the man seemed almost invisible on paper. No history beyond a few employment files, no traces of the life he had once lived. And yet, Jonathan sensed there was more, something unspoken, something heavy that clung to him like a shadow. As the morning hours passed, Liang Chen's entourage arrived once again, their presence commanding, their silence sharp. The billionaire himself walked with measured steps, his expression unreadable. Jonathan braced himself, but to his surprise, Liang Chen paused in the lobby, scanning the crowd until his eyes settled on Wei, who stood quietly near the entrance with his cart. "Come," Liang Chen said in Mandarin, gesturing for him. The word was simple, but it carried weight. Wei hesitated, then obeyed, stepping forward with a bow. The billionaire placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, guiding him into the conference room as though he were not a cleaner at all, but an honored advisor. The sight stunned everyone. Jonathan felt a flicker of pride mixed with unease. His empire, his reputation, his fortune now anchored to this man. Inside the conference room, the air grew heavy. Papers were spread, voices rose and fell, translators shifted uncomfortably. Yet whenever tension threatened to shatter the fragile progress, Wei's voice steadied it. His translations softened sharp edges, his tone calmed tempers. His words carried a quiet authority that no contract could bind. It became clear, even to Jonathan, that Liang Chen trusted him more than anyone else in the room. But beneath that composure, Jonathan noticed something else, a flicker in Wei's eyes, brief but undeniable. Pain, regret, as though every word he spoke carried the weight of a memory. That evening, after the meeting had concluded, Jonathan could not shake the feeling. He found Wei alone in the staff corridor, rolling his cart back to the supply room. "You're carrying something," Jonathan said quietly. "Something you're not telling me." Wei froze, his hands tightening around the handle of the cart. For a moment, Jonathan thought he would walk away, but instead, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging as though the burden he had carried for years had grown too heavy to hide. There are things, Wei said softly, that follow a man no matter how far he runs. Jonathan waited, but Wei said no more. He simply bowed his head and disappeared into the dim corridor, leaving Jonathan with questions that gnawed at him like fire. The truth came the next day, though not in the way Jonathan expected. During the final round of negotiations, a sudden disruption rippled through the room. A member of Liang Chen's entourage, sharp-eyed, stern-faced, pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. He spoke rapidly in Mandarin, his voice laced with suspicion. Jonathan could not follow, but he saw the Wei's face paled. Liang Chen opened the folder. Inside were documents, photographs, records, and in that instant, Jonathan understood. Someone had uncovered Wei's past. The billionaire's eyes narrowed as he scanned the pages. He looked up at Wei, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Is this true? Silence fell. Every gaze fixed on the cleaner, the man who had become the quiet center of their hopes. Jonathan's heart hammered. He did not know what the documents contained, but he could see the storm in Wei's eyes. Wei lowered his head, his voice steady but laced with sorrow. Yes, it is true. The room erupted in murmurs. Jonathan leaned forward, desperate. What is this? What are they saying? The interpreter hesitated, then answered softly. They are saying he was once more than a teacher in his country. He stood against corruption. He spoke for those who had no voice. It brought him respect, but also enemies. He was forced to leave. He came here because staying meant danger not only for him, but for those he loved. Jonathan stared, stunned. The cleaner he thought he had discovered was not merely a man of hidden talent. He was a man who had once stood against giants and paid the price. Liang Chen's eyes softened, though his tone remained sharp. You carried this truth in silence, he said in Mandarin. Why? Wei bowed. Because some truths are too heavy to share. I wanted only to work quietly, to harm no one, to live with dignity. If I revealed who I once was, I feared I would bring trouble here. This hotel, these people, they gave me a place when I had none. I did not want to endanger that. The room grew still. Even the entourage, once suspicious, seemed unsettled by the honesty in his voice. Jonathan felt something crack open inside him. For years, he had believed strength was measured in wealth, in control, in triumph. But here was a man who had lost everything, who carried scars unseen, and yet still chose humility over bitterness, service over pride. Liang Chen leaned back slowly, studying Wei with an expression Jonathan could not read. Then, to the astonishment of everyone, the billionaire rose from his chair and bowed not deeply, but enough to carry meaning. Integrity, he said in Mandarin, is rarer than gold. The words rippled through the room like a wave. Wei lowered his head, his face calm though his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Jonathan's chest tightened. He knew then that this story was no longer about contracts or markets. It was about redemption, resilience, and the courage of a man who refused to surrender his dignity, even when the world had stripped him bare. And though the deal would go on, Jonathan understood something far greater had already been won. The city awoke with restless energy the next morning, but inside the regal crown, the atmosphere felt strangely fragile, as though every marble column and gilded railing carried the echo of what had unfolded in the conference room the night before. The revelation of Wei's past still lingered like a storm cloud that refused to drift away. Staff whispered in corners, some astonished, some doubtful, and others inspired. To them, the humble cleaner was no longer just a man in gray. He was someone who had once stood against injustice, someone who had paid a price none of them could imagine. Jonathan could not stop thinking about it. He had always believed he understood the world, how it worked, who held power, what defined success. Yet the quiet man who had once polished mirrors in silence had overturned all of it. Jonathan sat at his desk, staring at the untouched papers of the negotiation, but his mind drifted back to Wei's words. Greatness often hides in silence. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something stir inside him, a discomfort he could not easily shake. He saw himself in the reflection of his office window, polished, confident, powerful. But behind that reflection now stood the shadow of Wei, reminding him of everything he had never dared to ask. What was the worth of success if it ignored The unseen, if it crushed those who sacrificed everything. Later that day, the staff cafeteria buzzed with voices. Jonathan, walking past unseen, heard snippets of conversations. The bellboys spoke of Way's courage, how he had once stood against forces larger than himself. The housekeepers whispered about his kindness, how he quietly fixed things that weren't his responsibility, how he offered words of encouragement without ever drawing attention. Even the stern chef, once dismissive, admitted that Way had earned respect no one else in the hotel ever had. Jonathan realized something astonishing. His staff, who for years had feared him more than admired him, now looked to Way for hope. He had never intended to create a culture of fear, but as he listened to their voices, he understood that was exactly what he had done. The cleaner had changed that in days, not with authority or wealth, but with humility and truth. As evening fell, Liang Chen requested one final dinner before his departure. The grand ballroom glittered with crystal and candlelight. Tables were laid with perfection, a symphony of silver and porcelain. But the air carried something heavier than elegance. It carried expectation. Everyone knew the outcome of this dinner would determine whether the contract was signed or lost. Jonathan arrived dressed sharply, but his eyes were restless, scanning for Way. He found him at the edge of the room, not as a guest but as a worker, quietly checking the arrangements, making sure everything shone. Jonathan walked to him. "You should be at the table," Jonathan said quietly. Way shook his head, his smile faint. "That is not my place." Jonathan's voice lowered, almost a whisper. "It was your words that brought us this far." "It is. Your strength he respects. Don't hide from that." Way looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "Sometimes the greatest service we give is not in standing at the front, but in lifting others so they can." The words struck Jonathan deeply. He wanted to argue, to insist, but the conviction in Way's tone silenced him. The dinner began. Liang Chen sat at the center, his presence commanding, his entourage around him. Conversation flowed, but it was careful, measured. Jonathan felt the weight of every glance, every pause. He spoke as best he could, trying to mirror the humility he had seen in Way. Yet more than once, his confidence faltered. And then, halfway through the evening, a crisis struck. A sudden outage. The lights flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed the ballroom, followed by the startled murmurs of the guests. Panic threatened to ripple. The hotel's generator was supposed to engage instantly, but it did not. Staff rushed to calm the guests, but the silence of the power failure grew heavier by the second. Jonathan's heart dropped. At the worst possible moment, the regal crown was crumbling. And then, through the shadows, a voice rose, calm, steady. "Ways, remain calm," he said firmly in Mandarin, his words carrying across the room. "This is temporary. You are safe." His tone was so confident, so grounding, that the panic ebbed instantly. Staff froze, then began to follow his lead. He instructed them quickly. Candles from the service carts, lanterns from the emergency stores. Staff posted at exits to guide guests. His knowledge of procedures, of systems most never thought twice about, revealed itself like a map he had carried all along. Within minutes, the ballroom glowed with candlelight. What could have been humiliation transformed into something almost magical. Guests whispered in awe, marveling at the elegance of the moment, as though the outage had been intentional, a romantic gesture instead of a disaster. Liang Chen watched Way closely. His expression softened, and when Way bowed slightly after ensuring all was well, the billionaire raised his glass toward him. No words were needed. Respect had been earned in fire. Once again, the generators finally kicked in, light returning to the chandeliers, but by then, something greater had already been illuminated. Jonathan knew it, the staff knew it, and Liang Chen knew it. The contract was no longer the real prize. The prize was the lesson none of them could ignore. Dignity and strength were not bound by position, and the man who swept floors could lead with more grace than the man who wore the crown. When the dinner ended and the documents were signed, sealing the deal, Jonathan felt no triumph. Instead, he felt humility. For the first time in his life, he recognized that his success had not been built by his hands alone. It had been saved by the courage of a man who asked for nothing, who had given everything. As Wei slipped quietly back into the shadows of his work, Jonathan's chest tightened. He knew the world would soon forget this night, would remember only that the Regal Crown had secured its contract. But he also knew there was a deeper story unfolding, one that would not let him rest until he understood it fully, and he could not escape the thought that fate was not yet finished with Wei or with him. The city was alive with celebration. Newspapers hailed the Regal Crown's triumph, praising Jonathan Hale for securing one of the most important contracts of the decade. Headlines called it a historic partnership. Investors flooded the hotel with congratulations, and the board toasted him as though he had climbed a mountain no one else could reach. Yet, as Jonathan stood before the cameras, shaking hands and smiling for photographs, he felt an emptiness inside him he could not disguise from himself. He knew the truth. The cameras would forever capture his name, but the story had never belonged to him. It belonged to the man who was absent from the celebrations, the man who had returned quietly to the Carters with his mop and broom, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. While the world applauded Jonathan, Wei was back polishing floors that gleamed under the same chandeliers where he had once saved them all from humiliation. Jonathan could not accept it. Something inside him rebelled at the idea that a man of such quiet greatness could vanish back into the shadows without acknowledgement. That evening, after the celebrations had faded and the board had left him with hollow praise, Jonathan went in search of Wei. He found him in the service corridor, kneeling beside a broken lamp, carefully repairing it with a small set of tools. His movements were steady, patient, as though fixing something so small mattered as much as saving $1 billion contract. "You shouldn't be here," Jonathan said, his voice rough with unspoken emotions. "Not like this. Not after everything you've done." Wei looked up, smiling faintly. "This is where I belong. I fix what is broken. That is enough." Jonathan felt anger rise, not at Wei, but at the injustice of it all. "It's not enough. Do you understand what you've done? You didn't just save a deal, you saved me, this hotel, all of us. And you do it quietly, as if it costs you nothing. But I know it does. You carry something heavy, and yet you still choose to serve in silence." Wei placed the repaired lamp aside, his eyes calm. "Mr. Hale, the world is filled with men who chase recognition. They run after glory, after power, after wealth. I have seen them rise and fall. But the world is also held together by those who work quietly, unseen. The cleaners, the builders, the forgotten hands. Without them, nothing stands. I chose to be one of those hands. I do not need applause to know my worth." The words struck Jonathan like a blade. He had built his life on applause, on recognition, on the need to prove himself above all others. Yet here was a man who found strength not in being seen, but in serving quietly. But fate was not finished testing either of them. Days later, just as Liang Chen prepared to depart New York, an unexpected crisis shook the hotel. A fire broke out in the lower kitchens, spreading smoke rapidly through the service corridors. Panic erupted as alarms blared and guests flooded the lobby. Staff rushed to guide them, but the fire threatened to climb upward faster than anyone could control. Jonathan stood frozen at first, his mind spinning, his empire teetering once more on the edge of disaster. And then, before his eyes, Wei emerged through the smoke. Not running, not panic, calm, steady, commanding. He directed staff to lead guests to safety, his voice cutting through the chaos with authority no one questioned. He moved into the smoke, helping carry out an elderly guest who had collapsed, then returned again without hesitation. "Someone stop him!" Jonathan shouted, fear clawing at his chest, but Wei had already vanished back into the flames. Minutes felt like hours. The fire crews arrived, battling the blaze, while Jonathan stood on the pavement outside the hotel, his heart pounding with dread. Staff and guests huddled together, whispering prayers, eyes scanning desperately for the man who had led them all to safety. And then, through the haze of smoke, Wei emerged once more. His face was streaked with soot, his uniform torn. But in his arms he carried a child who had been trapped in the chaos. The crowd gasped, then erupted in applause and relief as he handed the child to her parents, bowing humbly before stepping aside. Jonathan rushed forward, gripping Wei's shoulders. Why? Why would you risk your life like that? Wei's eyes, calm even in exhaustion, met his. Because some things are worth more than life itself. If we have the strength to protect others, we must use it. That is the only legacy that matters. Jonathan's throat tightened. He realized in that moment that he had been chasing the wrong legacy all along. It was not wealth, nor reputation, nor control that defined greatness. It was courage, humility, and the willingness to serve without expecting reward. In the days that followed, the fire was controlled, the hotel restored, and life moved forward. But nothing felt the same. Guests who had witnessed Wei's bravery told their stories across the world. They spoke not of the CEO, not of the billionaire guest, but of the cleaner who had risen in the smoke to save lives. His name spread, not through fame he sought, but through the gratitude of those who had seen his courage. And Jonathan, standing in the lobby of his hotel, finally understood. He called his staff together and spoke words he had never spoken before. "This place," he said, "does not stand because of me. It stands because of people like Wei. He is proof that greatness does not come from the title we wear, but from the choices we make when the world needs us most." The staff cheered, some wept, and Wei, standing at the edge of the crowd, bowed his head humbly, as though he did not deserve it. But Jonathan knew. He knew the truth that would live in his heart for the rest of his days. The empire he had built was not his true legacy. Wei was. The man who had once walked invisibly through his halls had become the light that revealed what true greatness meant. And though history might record the deal, the fire, the success of the regal crown, Jonathan knew that in the quiet corners of memory, people would tell another story, the story of the cleaner who spoke with the wisdom of a scholar, who carried himself with the dignity of a king, and who proved, when the world trembled, that the greatest heroes often rise from the shadows, where no one thought to look.